G'day everyone, you're watching Kath with a K, and I'm Kath. This video is a part 2 to the previous video I made about violence and metal music. In the previous video I was focusing on fans, and in this video I'm going to be focusing on the musicians themselves and what they are saying about whether their music endorses violence or not. I'm going to be trying to do this video without my glasses because I noticed that the ring light was reflecting a lot in my glasses in the last video. Also, this is going to be my last regular YouTube video on this channel, but I'll explain more about that at the end if you're interested. First, I want to talk about the concept of transgression in metal music, then people's general comments on metal music without talking about specific bands. Then I want to look at what specific bands have said in relation to being blamed for different violent events. Finally, I will talk about Norwegian Black Metal, which seems to be a very important part of the puzzle, before sharing my hypothesis about blaming metal music for violence and how that has come to happen. So first of all, transgression. Transgression in the literature that I read seems to be used to talk about crossing the limits or boundaries that are understood to be what is acceptable in society. In Transgression and Mundanity, the global extreme metal music scene, Keith Daniel Harris says that contemporary Western societies are not structured by clearly definable binary principles that extend uniformly over society as a whole. However, within all societies, there are boundaries between that which can and cannot be practiced. Also, I forgot to say in the beginning that this doesn't directly relate to what musicians have said about whether their music encourages violence or not, but I did read about this concept of different types of transgression in a few places, and that ties into my conclusion about heavy music and violence, so I thought it would be important to bring up. Harris identifies 3 types of transgression in metal music. So there's sonic or musical transgression, there's content or lyrical transgression, and then there's also practical transgression. So in terms of sonic transgression, there are certain sounds that are seen as unacceptable in the majority of Western music, but a lot of these sounds are used in heavy metal and extreme metal genres especially take this to another level, such as using darker modes, which are types of scales. Another sound that could be seen as not generally accepted in a lot of Western music is heavily distorted guitar, and also screamed vocals and just any sort of really powerful and aggressive vocals. Also, some genres of metal use quite extreme tempos, usually on the fast end. Finally, a typical song structure might not be used as much in certain metal genres. Then there is a lyrical transgression, so there are a lot of songs in heavier genres that will talk about topics that are seen as taboo, like suicide or death or Satanism. Then there is practical transgression, which refers to actually behaving in a transgressive way, so committing crimes, burning down churches, killing people, that sort of thing. Moving on to general comments about metal music, there was a Power and Authenticity paper that I read, and the authors argued that extreme metal especially seems to equate authenticity with brutality, and has evolved an outlook that frames mainstream metal bands as feminine and thus inauthentic, because the authenticity and brutality can also be tied to masculinity in some of these subgenres. And actually, a sample group that was interviewed who were fans of these extreme metal genres used a lot of sexist and homophobic language to describe and denounce such bands that, I don't know, I would probably term as lighter metal, which is ironically called heavy metal. There was also this idea of cultural or subcultural capital. Honestly, I didn't fully understand the difference between both of them, but basically where certain behaviors are seen as important and gaining someone more status. So if someone behaving in a transgressive way and committing certain crimes gives them more status, then other people that are a part of the scene will see that and be like, yeah, I want more status, so I'm going to do these things as well. In the Norwegian black metal scene, especially, Norwegian black metal is going to come up quite a few times in this video. It created an ever increasing upping of the ante that requires ever more more radical displays of trueness. It is in this manner that Norwegian black metal went beyond fundamentalism and into militancy, encouraging a revival of Norwegian pagan nationalism that was severely anti-Christian, fascistic, intolerant, and completely rejected the modern. The association with far-right extremist ideologies in black metal soon became fused with the fundamental underlying concepts of power in true metal. One important thing to note is that even within black metal, there are a lot of subgenres. So this idea of far-right extremist ideologies being part of black metal is probably really only a small subgenre of black metal. So this is probably what the literature referred to as National Socialist black metal, thematically focused on racism, fascism, and or nationalism. So that is also not something that is true of all black metal. Before I get into talking more about the black metal scene, I want to talk about other probably more popular artists who have been blamed for violent acts and how they responded to it. I ideally wanted to find some interviews with different metal bands where they were asked about, does your music promote violence and stuff, without the context of being blamed for, let's say, a mass shooting event or something. But I spent a few hours trying to find even one interview like that, and I only found things that were directly related to specific events. So there could definitely be an element of these bands maybe just don't want to have a black mark against them in the public eye. But then again, when you look at, say, Norwegian Black Metal, which we will come back to, those bands definitely publicly advocated for violence. And also we can look at the fact that, some artists don't really have any accusations of crimes or violence against them, and some artists do. So I think there's enough evidence to still say that there is quite a bit of range in the arena of metal. One band that was blamed for a slashing incident at a South African school was Slipknot, and Corey Taylor from the band commented that, obviously I'm disturbed by the fact that people were hurt and someone died. As far as my responsibility for that goes, it stops there because I know our message is actually very positive. There are always going to be mental disorders and people who cause violence for no other reason than the fact that they're fucked up and lost. Then I also found a documentary where someone from Seven Dust briefly talked about their music and violence in general. They said, we'd rather people come to our shows and get their aggressions out in a positive way with a smile on your face than to get in a car and go shoot people and have road rage. Seven Dust seems to be saying that they believe their music is decreasing violent acts and that they clearly would prefer people to not be violent. Linkin Park also had a school shooting blamed on them, and their response to that was just one small statement. Like everyone else, we are extremely saddened by these events, and our hearts go out to the families and friends of the victims. Now, Linkin Park was actually a band where I found an interview where they were talking about violence and their music in general. So I want to just share a little bit about what they said. The guitarist, Brad Delson, addressed the topic of the band's lyrics, saying that whatever influence they have should be viewed as positive and not negative. He says, we're definitely dealing with really dark themes, but I think that's what's positive. When I was growing up, music was always really important in my life. If I ever had a problem, I'd sit in my room and listen to music, and I'd feel like, hey, I'm not alone. I can relate to these other groups that are feeling this way, and they'd make me feel okay. He says there's a misconception that angry music is going to make someone angry, but I think it's cathartic, and I think that a lot of kids who do have problems, they can relate to the lyrics and can go, oh, it's okay to feel that way. I'm not uncool if I feel insecure. We've all had problems growing up, shit that you have to deal with as a kid and even as a young adult. I can't speak for the others because these are personal things that they're dealing with. They're telling stories and trying to describe emotions that are very significant to them. They're doing it in a way that says, here's a feeling I have. A lot of their themes seem to be universal. Chester and Mike are really trying to be honest and not say, hey, we're the coolest guys, grab your 40. Then we've got Drowning Pool, and their many controversies, it seems, around the song Bodies. They actually had to release a statement in response to being blamed for a shooting, saying, "We were devastated this weekend to learn of the tragic events that occurred in Arizona and that our music has been misinterpreted. Bodies was written about the brotherhood of the mosh pit and was never about violence." Saying, "It's about my perspective when I look out and see the pit. It's about forgetting everything that has happened to you that week. Leave your bullshit at the door and get it all out. But you have to have respect for the others in the pit. If you push them down, you have to pick them back up. Sometimes it does get out of hand and I'll say something. I'll tell them not to hurt each other." At the end of 1985, there were some men who had spent 6 hours drinking, smoking marijuana, and listening to Judas Priest's album called Stained Class. And after this 6-hour session, they both committed suicide. And the media went into a frenzy, attacking Judas Priest, saying that their music was the reason that these people killed themselves. And they actually had to go to court over it as well. When Rob Halford of the band was asked about his experience in the courtroom, he said, "I really wanted to go over to the mother of the boy who killed himself and give her a hug and say, 'I'm sorry for the loss of your kid. Let's go have a coffee and talk this over.' But I think the deeper end of the story was that the people who were working for her in terms of prosecution was a very tangled web, because we heard there was a kind of infiltration from the extreme right-leaning Christian groups that were urging them to pursue the case, telling them that we were responsible. But I would have loved to have just had the opportunity just to be with that family and let common sense prevail and talk it out. But you can't, because it's obviously a highly charged emotional circumstance when you've lost your children. You're bound to be angry, you're bound to be upset, and you're bound to be looking for some explanation." He also added that these 2 young men lost their lives because of their tragic involvement in drugs and alcohol and dysfunctional family units in which they weren't given proper care, attention, or guidance. "I'm not making light of a tragic situation, but this trial was just an attempt to shift the burden of guilt to someone else's shoulders. We gave them a great deal of pleasure with our music. Now, I'd be more than pleased if we were just allowed to get on with our creativity and continue to bring pleasure and entertainment to the countless millions of people who have been listening to this music completely harm-free for many years." And continuing about his belief that his music is a positive influence on the lives of a lot of listeners, he says, "When you're 15 or 16 and you're confused, your body's changing, your head's changing because of what's going on in the world, your best friend at that time is generally music. Nothing makes sense until you go home and turn on your Walkman or your radio, and there's the music. There's your friend, there is somebody that you can relate to, somebody who understands your problems and conditions, who has the same dreams and aspirations in life." The last, more mainstream artist that I want to talk about is Marilyn Manson. He was also blamed for a shooting at one point, and he actually appeared in a documentary about it called Bowling for Columbine. The documentary also talks about how many were trying to identify what made the shooters commit their violent acts, and some media were quick to connect the shooters to Marilyn Manson, even though they were not fans of the band. However, Manson himself undermined this oppositional image in his response to the massacre. In an open letter published in Rolling Stone, he argued that Christianity has given us an image of death and sexuality that we have based our culture around, drawing the controversy back within the boundaries of society rather than allowing himself to be used as a marginalized Satan. So he clearly does not believe that his music promotes these actions, and seems to believe that things that actually aren't transgressive in society, going back to what I was talking about at the start of the video, things that are already within the bounds of like what is acceptable in society is actually more of a cause for these violent actions, such as, you know, the current gun laws in America and perhaps even Christianity. He has also been quoted as saying, "I wouldn't say a single word to them. I would listen to what they have to say, and that's what no one did." When asked, "What would you say if you were to talk directly to the kids at Columbine?" There is a bit going on with Marilyn Manson recently, isn't there? A lot of you have probably heard that he has been accused of being quite abusive. So I think that this is important to take into account when it comes to, you know, metal musicians and whether they promote violence or commit violent acts in real life. An ex of his was talking about their relationship being abusive, like him being abusive to her. And she says, 2 years into my abusive relationship, I resorted to self-harm. When my abuser would threaten or attack me, I cut my wrist as a way to disarm him. It only made the abuse stop. temporarily. At this point, I was desperate to stop the abuse and I was too terrified to leave. Manson has also talked about this in an interview before she was coming out with these accusations more recently. And he said, I wanted to show her the pain that she put me through. It was like, I want you to physically see what you've done. But that damage is part of it, and the song I Want to Kill You Like They Do in the Movies is about my fantasies. I have fantasies every day about smashing her skull in with a sledgehammer. Listen, I really hope he doesn't actually do that, but yeah, that would be an example of an artist who does make some songs in the metal space being a violent person if these allegations are true. But I would argue that this doesn't actually have anything to do with metal music, because there are lots of celebrities, powerful people that do a lot of heinous things to people who have nothing to do with metal music. So I think this is more of a result of celebrity. Celebrity definitely gives you more of an opportunity to actually take advantage of people. We've seen like Harvey Weinstein, David Dobrik, who else is there? Bill Cosby. Michael Jackson. Yeah, that seems more of a celebrity kind of thing, especially since he did specifically say that he doesn't think his music communicates this message. So I believe whatever violence he may be allegedly acting out towards people are not connected to his music. After discussing a lot of bands that talk about their music aiming to be a positive force for people and not encouraging violence, let's get into Norwegian black metal, which seems to be quite the opposite. So, in the early 1990s, Norwegian black metal went to a level of violence that had previously been unseen in the metal world. There were a lot of churches burnt down, and a lot of musicians in the scene were arrested for arson and ended up spending time in prison. There were also a number of murders associated with the scene. This Norwegian black metal scene in the early 1990s was perhaps metal's most famous example of the prestige and status that can be gleaned from connecting music to real acts of transgression. This is one case in which violent imagery was employed not simply as part of a performance of transgression, but as a serious attempt to construct music as a springboard from which violent actions should logically emerge. So people who were committing crimes such as arson and murder in this scene were seen as oh my goodness. These criminals were seen as being the most authentic black metal musicians or fans, and they were supposedly truly living out the sentiments of the music. Members of this Norwegian scene also stressed that their music and personas were authentically evil rather than just using imagery of evil. There's one particular band that seems to have garnered a lot of notoriety and publicity in this scene, and that is Mayhem. They were one of the earliest bands to engage in what has been labeled as transcendent violence, which is linking their music to actual acts of violence instead of simply alluding to acts of violence. A series of church arsons, 2 high-profile murders, and a case of suicide involving prominent scene members, especially within the band Mayhem, grabbed the attention of the mainstream media and caused a period of moral panic within Norwegian society. This emphasis on transgressive behaviour also translated into their live shows. The members of the band each had their own pseudonyms, and one of them was called Dead. He would frequently self-mutilate on stage and also have impaled pig heads on stage, which has since become an accessory that is used in black metal in general, apparently. According to an interview with Dead from 1989, his stage antics were not just supposed to be a spectacle, but were also supposed to weed out posers or people who weren't truly fans and were just tourists. In 1991, Dead committed suicide. Then another member of Mayhem, Euronymous, kind of used the death of Dead to gain more publicity and was pretty callous about it. He supposedly fashioned fragments of Dead's skull into necklaces, with further pieces sent to other friends and contacts of the band. This eventually led to a pretty infamous case of murder, of Euronymous by another member of Mayhem. And there was actually an interview with some of the remaining members of Mayhem where another member said that he had kind of been planning to kill him himself. So he felt like he had been beaten to it. He was quite upset about how Euronymous treated the death of Dead. So I don't really know if the person who actually did murder Euronymous, if that was also his reasoning, but what he said to the press and at trial was that he was trying to protect himself from being murdered because he had heard that Euronymous was planning to kill him. Moynihan and Soderlind, who have written about the black metal scene a fair bit, had the following to say on the impact of the murder. The death of Euronymous shook the black metal scene to its core. Until that point, many felt they could continue to escape the repercussions of their deeds unscathed. Deeds which by now had become a veritable shopping list of church arson, murder, burglary, death threats, grave desecration, and vandalism. So essentially, in the early 1990s, black metal bands were trying to make metal real again and remove its mundanity. So, people still trying to have like everyday lives, but just listening to the music and having, participating in the scene and events around music, just kind of like a separate little bubble and not something that translates into everyday life. And this led to a lot of the practical transgression that we were seeing in the black metal scene that I've spoken about. We've come to the part of the video where I would now like to share my hypothesis after the last 2 or 3 weeks of research and what I've talked about in these last 2 videos. I will say it's more of a hypothesis than a conclusion because I'm using all the information I've gathered here, but I'm also adding in some of my own anecdotal evidence. I haven't really found any sort of, questionnaire that anyone's been given to support this assumption that I'm making, which is that the average non-fan of metal, or at least people who believe that all of metal is violent, can't differentiate between different types of metal, or at least don't realize that metal is actually an extremely vast umbrella of genres and attitudes towards music and scenes. We can clearly see that there is a subgenre of metal that is encouraging violence and where violence is, or was, I suppose, a big part of that Norwegian black metal scene, or as it may now be sometimes referred to, the true black metal scene. And I imagine that there are probably other pockets of relatively small metal scenes and subgenres that may also have this kind of approach to music and violence and that they should be interlinked. However, they're probably not as infamous as the Norwegian black metal bands and Mayhem were. But having looked at how a lot of other metal musicians respond to being blamed for acts of violence, and how Linkin Park just talked about negative themes in their lyrics in general, we can see that there are definitely a lot of metal musicians who don't condone violence. I believe that this idea that metal is violent or encourages violence may be from, hearing about certain metal bands such as maybe Mayhem encouraging and performing a lot of practical transgression as well as lyrical and sonic transgression. And then people who perform similar types of sonic or lyrical transgression, then in the minds of the people who have heard about the Norwegian black metal bands, they probably think that that means that they must also practice practical transgression. And I'm sure that there are a lot of people who heard of Mayhem and various violent acts associated with metal music, and they formed this idea that metal is violent, and then they sort of passed on that idea to people who hadn't really heard about the specifics of the Norwegian black metal scene. So then it's become this big thing that metal is violent. And then there's probably also an element of some people probably just hear the sonic and lyrical transgression and maybe assume that that will also lead to practical transgression. Like, you have broken the bounds of what is seen as acceptable in society in this one way, so you're probably fine with breaking it in these other ways. So my hypothesis is that people think that metal is violent because people don't know the difference between different metal subgenres, and people are conflating different types of transgression. The reason I believe that people might not be aware of the huge diversity within metal is because before I started listening to some music that I liked and realized that it actually counted as metal, I also was not aware that there were a lot of different types of metal. And even when it comes to Norwegian black metal, we also need to be aware that even within black metal, there are many different subgenres. So it's not even all black metal that endorses violence. For example, there's folk black metal, progressive black metal, avant-garde black metal, true black metal, which is what we talked about, that's the Norwegian black metal, black and death metal, industrial black metal, and there's still even more. So, maybe if someone says, yeah, I'm really into Norwegian black metal and I'm like a big fan of the scene and I like go to all the events and I love true black metal, then you should probably be on your guard. If someone says, I'm a fan of symphonic black metal or folk black metal or any other sort of metal, you probably don't need to worry any more than you would for any other person who likes any other sort of music. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something, and definitely comment down below, what you found interesting or what your takeaway is. I know in the last video I talked more about heavy music in general, which also included punk and hard rock and in some cases even heavy rap, but that's because those studies grouped all those genres together, whereas these papers talked more specifically about just extreme metal. So it was a little hard to connect these two videos completely. I feel like I still learned a lot. Now, the last thing I wanted to mention is that I will no longer be uploading regularly to this channel. I, ideally would like to make YouTube my job, but that clearly isn't happening, and now I actually need a job to earn money, so I now have a almost full-time job, and along with studying part-time I just don't have the time to also do this, which is kind of sad because I like making videos, but I also don't want to stress myself out trying to do everything that I want to do as well as working. So I'll still be making some content, but every month or two is probably what you can expect. I'll need to change my banner because it currently says new video every Monday. But if you do want to see more of me, and maybe you don't specifically only want to watch stuff about music, I do actually have a camping vlog channel, which you can go to see more regular videos from me. They take a lot less time to make, so it's much more sustainable for me, although I'm kind of interested in both channels and what I put out. So I'll be posting there every probably 2 weeks on average. Yeah, and that's just of my travels around Australia. If you want to see what my trips were like and what all the camping and cycling and hiking is like, then go check that out, or follow me on Instagram if you want to see updates around my music, because I'll probably be posting little sneak peeks every week of various projects I'm working on. So see you in a month or two, unless you want to go over to the Nomad Cath channel. Bye!